Welcome to Citizens Reunited to Overcome Cancer.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Here is your host, Dr. E.
Howdy, Croc Nation. Dr. Tommy and Ellie here with you with another great Croc podcast. Alongside of me, as always, Angel Santana. Have faith, let it begin. Angel, I'm starting to get used to the every 2-week routine, and it's not a bad thing.
It's interesting, so to speak. And as I've listed on last week's episode, I let everybody know in Citizens Reunited to Overcome Cancer that we'll be doing an every other weekday episodes, but we are going to be airing older episodes. But on January, the first week of January is really when things are going to make things a little bit more interesting, because we're going to actually start Citizens Reunited to Overcome Cancer from episode 1 on our off days. So it gives everybody an opportunity to go back and say, okay, let's start a new year, and I can go back and do the archives and catch up.
And from my perspective, we are here for our survivor thrivers. We're here to give them very impactful information. And I have to be honest with you, when I have the 2 weeks to prepare an episode, I'm able to prepare it fuller. I'm more focused on it. I'm able to get more resources, and I'm able to actually be able to think. I'm able to be able to mull over an idea that I want to share. And all of my podcasts are based on personal experiences. And this week is a perfect example of something that happened to me at work, something that moved me greatly. And I really had 2 weeks to really mull on it and think about it, and to be able to provide this insight to our survivor thrivers. And it's really going to be honoring a group of people who really are due for recognition and deserve recognition and are very, very unappreciated, and that's our nurses. I'm thinking, Angel, you would agree with that.
Absolutely. Anytime I hear anything as far as any type of position, especially nursing, I think of just one word: hero.
Hero, a superhero, even. I'm going to even go one step further. So to set the table for today's podcast, it begins with a friend of mine. His name is Frank. Frank was a patient of mine many, many years ago. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. He worked in New York City in the construction trades. He was an amazing heavy equipment operator. He helped put up the World Trade Center, and he helped clean up the mess of the World Trade Center. That's probably where he ended up with his cancer. That's where I got to meet him, and that's how I took care of him, and we actually cured him of his cancer. And as it turned out, we were neighbors. And of course, like we try to do with all of our survivor thrivers, offer our friendship. And we had such a beautiful friendship with he and his wife, Cookie. We lived down the street from each other. We would go out to dinner. And then, like every great relationship, it got destroyed by COVID. So, they being elderly and they being, more at risk for getting a COVID related issue as it related to health. I didn't see them for a while, probably didn't see them face to face for a few years. Saw him earlier in the year, was doing super well, had no problems. And then all of a sudden he got stricken with a very strange and unusual neurological illness, which really started eating away at him. And Denise and I tried to intervene and ask if they needed anything. And, he was a very proud man, and his wife, a very proud woman. And they tried to do everything themselves. God bless them. And he got sicker and he got sicker and he got sicker. And then last week I went to visit him in the hospital, and he looked terrible. And then his condition began to escalate. He started to deteriorate. He started to sort of tank out. His lungs were giving out, and he got transferred to the intensive care unit. And the family and the doctors were very concerned. So they told the family to call in their son from the West Coast. Now, the problem is that Frank was in the ICU. He was bleeding. He was going into organ shutdown. He was hypotensive, and his son was going to be arriving to the hospital about 10 p.m. The problem was it was only 4 p.m. And there was a drama that played out. It was just such an inspirational and moving situation, that I have to share it with the Proc Nation, because it really does emphasize how amazing our nurses are, not just our cancer nurses, but all nurses. And it just so happens that Frank, as a cancer survivor, thriver, you know, it makes it apropos to discuss on this format. So I walked into the room around 4 o'clock, and I took stock of the situation. And I really, Angel, to be honest with you, I went in not as a doctor, but I went in just as a friend. And I was concentrating on Frank, who was trying to communicate with me, and he had the tube down his throat. And then I was there with his wife, Cookie, and trying to, calm her down and keep her, although she was quite, she was so strong, such a strong person. But I just was in a fog, which I think you would understand. And as the nurse was just kind of doing her dance in the room, I wasn't even really paying attention to what she was doing. The doctor part of me started to come out and started to volcano up and started to churn into bubble. And I was really taken by one of the most emotionally moving and inspirational displays of medical heroism, as you mentioned, that I've ever seen in my entire career. For 6 long, grueling, physically, emotionally draining, and depleting hours, these nurses literally, breathe life into his lungs. Like, everyone thinks if you're on a respirator that everything's automatic. It's anything but that. Trying to keep that airway, intact, trying to suction out all the mucus plugs. That's very difficult. And they circulated life into his veins. They literally, while he was bleeding, they were putting back blood into his body, not just by just hanging a bag of blood, but actually hand pushing the blood into his veins and into his circulatory system, so he could maintain a blood pressure. And they did all of this maintaining composure, maintaining dignity, maintaining confidence, all the time, so the family had something to hang on to. They upheld Frank's dignity. His bed was clean and crisp. There was not one drop of blood, despite the fact he was actively bleeding and he was receiving blood, and he was impeccable. He was clean. I think of Jesus in that shroud. Frank was perfectly clean in that beautiful white linen. And they kept him comfortable, and they kept him focused, and they kept him fearless. So Frank did not have that look of fear in his eyes. And that was all because of them. And what I realized was I was watching these nurses while they were multitasking. Angel, the dexterity of what they were doing with their hands. They were injecting medicine with one hand into an IV pole, pushing blood with the other. Their eyes were on the monitors. I mean, it was really unbelievable, what they were doing. Their judgment was impeccable, and their skills were unbelievable. It was like watching a ballet. It was like watching a world-class Russian ballerina just gracefully, dance across the stage. This nurse and her colleagues were just, it was like perfect the way that they were coordinated the care of Frank. And they did this not because they knew they could save his life. They did this because they wanted his son to be there to hold his hand before he died. And it was, another analogy that I placed was, it was like watching a test pilot try to fly a plane that was unflyable, and keeping their composure to keep the plane from just breaking apart. And by the way, Angel, 2 more things. They did it without any help from any doctors. I didn't see any doctor there the entire time I was visiting, and I didn't see any of the residents. It was strictly a nursing operation. Number 2, they did it without being told. Like, there were orders, there were the doctor's orders, but no one No doctor, I don't care if they were Ben Casey or the most famous doctor in the world, could have ever criticized them if Frank would have died before his son came. They were literally keeping him alive, with their skills and with their passion and with their desire to make this family come together. And it was just such a moving experience. And if he would have died, that would have made their shift so much easier. It would have made it less stressful. It would have been less physically exhausting. It would have not been a burdensome shift. They were killing themselves. Angel, they were killing themselves. But what they say in the space program is the same thing that every nurse says as a motto: failure is not an option. They were not going to they were going to will Frank to stay alive until his son came to join him. And at first, as I said to you, and I said to my friends in the Croc Nation, I wasn't paying attention. I was a friend. I wasn't a doctor. And I was focused on Frank. I was focused on his wife. I was focused on his son who lived locally. And to the untrained eye, Angel, there was nothing going on that the nurses did not tip their hand at all that Frank had any chance of dying before his son showed up. And no one except the nurses and me knew that this was not a foregone conclusion. We knew that it was going to take every amount of effort in order to achieve that. And we were the only ones who knew this. And they did it without saying a word. They didn't pat themselves on the back. They didn't say anything that would make the family feel at all in any way stressed, more stressed than they already were. And I was able to be a fly on the wall for not a long amount of time, but enough of the time to be able to see this. And what I was going to say was that miracle was not going to be a miracle that came from heaven. That miracle was going to be a miracle from the sheer will of these nurses. And as I stood there and sat there in that ICU room, at that moment, I gained so much clarity, Angel, so much clarity about how undervalued and underappreciated our nurses are in general. So our nurses are underappreciated. They are not doctors. They don't want to be doctors. If they wanted to be doctors, they could have been doctors. They wanted to be nurses. They did not go to medical school because they didn't want to go to medical school. They wanted to go to nursing school. They wanted to become a nurse. They get none of the credit that the doctors get, and they get all of the blame if something goes wrong. They are left to clean up all the messes that we leave behind for them. They have to cover up for us because we don't spend any time with our patients. They have to cover up because we don't explain anything to our patients. They have to cover up for the lack of caring, and I hate to say it, that my colleagues express many times in many instances that I see in the hospital. So while we sit in our air-conditioned, comfortable, safe, and pimped out doctors' lounges and headquarters, it's the nurses that are in the trenches. They're in the trenches with bullets buzzing over their heads and shells exploding everywhere. Our nurses are underestimated. Doctors don't lean on the skills of our nurses enough. Listening to a nurse's intuition rather than ignoring them has saved so many lives. By us ignoring our nurses and their intuition, it has cost more lives and caused more pain than any other cause of deaths in the hospital. And that includes medication error, human error, anything, add them all together. If you listen to your nurse, many of our patients could be saved. And we need to recognize the value of our nurses, not as inferior colleagues, but as equal colleagues. Our nurses are underutilized. We need to stop turning nurses into executive assistants for doctors. They're not that. They're nurses. We need to support our nurses so they can nurse instead of scribing. We need to support them. We need to recognize them as the great professionals that they are. Our nurses are undervalued. It's time to compensate our nurses appropriately. And when I say compensation, I don't just mean monetarily compensating them with money, which of course we want to do also, but in all aspects of their professional lives. We want to support them with continuing education. We want them to grow professionally. We want to support them at work. We want to give them a safe and nurturing environment, not a hostile environment, not an environment, where there's all these code grays where nurses probably are afraid to come to work, or not even supported or thought of well, by the other coworkers, whether they're the doctors or even the engineers or even the maintenance people. Our nurses need to have a safe and nurturing environment. We have to provide humanistic support for all of the stress that they have to endure, and which is inherent in their job. We have to protect their mental health and their physical health by giving them the resources to be healthy in all aspects of their life. And we have to make sure that we have job security for them and long-term life planning. We need to give them resources to assist them have happy personal lives and a chance for a well-deserved future. And to conclude the story, Frank did end up dying. We knew he was going to die. His lungs finally gave out. His heart finally gave out. His blood pressure finally gave out. And despite the otherworldly efforts of those ICU nurses who were brilliant, all their skill, all their experience, all of the sweat that they expended that night, all of the tricks and all of their hopes, Frank still died. But Frank died the next day, the next morning, and Frank was surrounded by his wife of 60 years. He was surrounded by his son, who lived locally, but most importantly, he was surrounded by his son, who flew across the country to be there, to take his rightful place as his dad transitioned to the next phase of existence. And that was all allowed to happen because of some great nurses who love what they do, nurses who are good at what they do, nurses who are proud of what they do. The Croc Podcast and the Croc Nation applaud you. Angel Santana, your thoughts?
Well, first and foremost, thoughts and prayers for that family. When the last time my pastor was in the hospital, the pastor wanted to ask the staff, the nurses, not so much as questions about, you know, do they like their job? Don't know. All he said was, "What made you get into this position?" And he asked the same question to about 15 people, and they all had the same answer. I love helping people. Nurses and, heroes, they are the front line. During the COVID times, we saw that firsthand, you and I. We got to see all of them put everything in action. But one thing is for sure, they wear the capes. They wear that S on their chest. And when they are headed to the front line, you almost feel as if that armor, that that cape, that outfit cannot be pierced by any bullet or arrow. We salute you, and I think that was something that we all needed to hear. So for that, I thank you.
Oh, Angel, I really appreciate it. And I will just want all of our nurses to know that this is a cancer survivor podcast, of course, and it is for our survivor thrivers in order to give our survivor thrivers information and opportunities to have a wonderful life. And I think it behooves us to recognize those professionals, the nurses, who are such a big part of that. This particular story did involve a cancer survivor, but it didn't necessarily involve a cancer nurse, but it did involve a nurse in general. All of our nurses, whether they are pediatric nurses, cardiac nurses, ICU nurses, emergency room nurses, or cancer center nurses, infusion nurses, radiation oncology nurses, surgical oncology nurses, whatever you are, wherever you work, what you do is important. I know that you get up in the morning and you go to work and there are many days you don't feel appreciated, where you don't feel that anyone's paying attention. But we here at the Croc Podcast, we are paying attention. And when I walked into that room, I didn't initially pay attention, but when I woke up, I saw exactly what you do. What you did for Frank is not something that happens once a year, once every 10 years, once every 50 years. It happens every day. It may not happen in Garnet Medical Center exactly that way every day, but it happens just like that somewhere else. And in Garnet Medical Center, in our Hudson Valley Hospital, some act of kindness, some act of mercy occurs because of the excellence of you guys. And really, this podcast was really more about you guys. We know all the great things you do and get recognized for, unfortunately not enough, but in this instance, it's to recognize all the things you do that no one knows about. It's all the unseen acts of kindness and compassion that you do. So we're going to conclude today's podcast as we do every podcast, but we're going to add a little something to it for our nurses. So, of course, on behalf of Angel and the board of directors, we wish all of our survivor thrivers a long, healthy, happy, and cancer-free life. And we also want to thank our good Lord, our Creator, for giving us nurses. God bless you. God be with you. Peace.
Hey, Croc Nation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast to your friends. Visit our website, crocvip.com. We would love to hear your feedback.